Hello, and welcome to the National Park Service and the Federal Aviation Administration public meeting for the draft air tour management plan for Mount Rainier National Park. I'm Michelle Carter, an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. I'd like to start off by defining a couple of acronyms that you'll hear us say. You'll hear us refer to the National Park Service as NPS, the Federal Aviation Administration as FAA, and the air tour management plans as ATMPs. We'll define the remaining acronyms as we go along. Next slide, please. We're holding this virtual public meeting to review the park's draft ATMP and to seek public feedback on it. This meeting is held pursuant to the National Parks Air Tour Management Act of 2000, also known as NEPA, and its implementing regulations. You'll hear more about NEPA and the draft ATMP shortly, along with information on how to submit questions and comments. But before we dive into the presentations, I'd like to take a minute to introduce our presenters and provide you with some information about meeting logistics and how you can participate. Next slide. So joining us this evening as presenters are Keith Lusk, Program Manager and Special Program Staff with the Western Pacific Region of FAA, Vicki Ward, Overflights Program Manager with the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division of the National Park Service, and Terry Tucker, the Planning and Compliance Branch Chief at Mount Rainier National Park. Keith and Vicki will provide a brief overview of NEPA and the purpose of today's meeting. We'll then hear from Terry, who will share more information from the park's perspective and discuss park-specific resources and the draft ATMP. Next slide, please. Throughout the meeting, we invite you to submit questions, which we'll address after the presentations as part of the Q&A session. Questions submitted through this evening's meeting will be considered by the agencies as they continue drafting the ATMPs, but they won't be considered formal comments. Next slide. All official comments must be submitted through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment site, or PEPC, or sent to the mailing addresses listed on that park's PEPC site. These formal comments will become a part of the official record, and we'll display this contact information later in the presentation. I also wanted to note that these formal comments must be submitted on or before August 28th of this year. Next slide, please. So our meeting is being live streamed across Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. If you're watching on one of these platforms, please submit your questions using the link to the Google form that FAA will post in the chat area of the platform that you're using. When the time comes, we'll read your question aloud and our presenters will respond. The team's going to do our best to answer all of the questions, but in the event that we don't get to your question, we'll provide contact information in the end where you can go for post-meeting follow-up. Our meeting will be 90 minutes long and we'll adjourn at 6 p.m. Pacific time. If we end up getting through all of the questions early, we'll still keep the meeting active until 6 p.m. just in case more questions come in. And additionally, I wanted to note that the meeting is being recorded. We appreciate you joining us this evening to learn more about Mount Rainier's draft ATMP. We'll now play a short video overview before I turn it over to Keith and Vicki to provide additional details about NEPA and why we're here today.
The United States is home to some of the most breathtaking national parks and tribal lands in the world. It is important that we protect these lands while ensuring that the public has ample opportunity to enjoy these national treasures. Air tours offer the public a totally different type of experience. The Federal Aviation Administration and the National Park Service work together to manage air tours over national parks. We are developing plans that help protect wildlife, wilderness character, cultural resources, natural soundscapes, and visitor enjoyment. These plans are known as Air Tour Management Plans, and today we will explore the specifics of the draft plan for your park. As part of our planning process, we consult with tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, state and tribal historic preservation officers, and wildlife biologists. We assess noise, wildlife protection, and other environmental considerations, and we will continue to make adjustments to these plans as needed. And we consider the appropriate level of National Environmental Policy Act review for these plans. The FAA and the National Park Service are committed to ensuring safe flights at our national parks while safeguarding park resources. Following today's presentation, we encourage you to review your park's draft air tour management plan and provide official comments through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment website. Together, we can celebrate these special places and ensure they can be enjoyed for generations to come.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Again, my name is Keith Lusk, and I'm a program manager with the Federal Aviation Administration. I'm here today with my colleague from the National Park Service, Vicki Ward. And it's our pleasure to provide you with just a little background and more information and context regarding the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, as well as air tour management plans in general. If we could go to the next slide, please. The National Parks Air Tour Management Act was enacted in April of 2000, and it had subsequent amendment provisions added in the year 2012. And just in terms of a general overview of what that act requires, it requires the FAA in cooperation with the Park Service to develop air tour management plans for the parks and tribal lands where operators have applied to conduct commercial air tours. It's important to note what an air tour management plan applies to and what it does not apply to. The Act applies strictly to commercial air tour operations that occur over the park or within a half-mile boundary of the park, over tribal lands within or abutting a park, and at altitude from essentially ground level to 5,000 feet above ground level while it's in that airspace. Next slide, please. Again, as I mentioned, the Act only regulates commercial air tour activity. It's important to note that when we're developing these plans, it's not going to address any type of general aviation activity, any commercial airline activity, or military flights. Nor does it apply to any parks, national park units that are in the state of Alaska. They were specifically exempted from the Act in the original legislation. It also does not apply to air tours that occur over Grand Canyon National Park. As most of you know, there's quite a few air tours that do occur over Grand National Park. There's separate legislation that oversees and regulates that flight activity. And also Rocky Mountain National Park is not included. In fact, air tours are prohibited from occurring at that park, and that was part of the original legislation. Parks with 50 or fewer annual flights were exempted from having to develop an air tour management plan. That was one of the new amendment provisions that came out in 2012. There is a specific clause in there, however, that the Park Service can withdraw that park from the exempt list if they deem that it's still necessary for the protection of park resources, visitor experiences, or other such measures that they think that the park would still need an air tour management plan developed. In fact, Mount Rainier would have been on the exempt park list, but it was withdrawn specifically by the Park Service, and that is why we're doing an air tour management plan at Mount Rainier. Also note that if abutting tribal lands are or may be overflown, the tribes will be invited as a cooperating agency for compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act. Next slide, please. This is really, the Act identifies and makes a distinction between two types of operators, existing operators and new entrant operators. Commercial air tour operators have to apply for the FAA for what is called operating authority in order to operate over the National Park System units in abutting tribal lands. The existing commercial air tour operators were those that had been flying at these parks before the National Parks Air Tour Management Act came into effect, which is basically the year 2000. So there was a lot of air tour operators that were flying in the years up to and previous to the year 2000, they were granted what was called interim operating authority, and they could continue to fly at those annual levels going forward until such time as the agencies developed air tour management plans. The second type of air tour operator is called a new entrant operator. A new entrant operator is anyone who came in after enactment of the act, which was in April 2000, and applied to the FAA for operating authority. Those are treated differently. They were not grandfathered in, but they could apply for interim operating authority to conduct flights and air tours at these parks. Next slide, and I will pass it over to my colleague, Vicki Ward.
Thanks, Keith. I'm Vicki Ward from the National Park Service, and I'll continue giving the overview of the National Parks Air Tour Management Act. The Act does specify an objective that needs to be addressed by the Air Tour Management Plan, and that is to develop acceptable and effective measures to mitigate or prevent the significant adverse impacts, if any, resulting from commercial air tour operations upon natural and cultural resources, visitor experiences, and tribal lands. Next slide. The contents of an air tour management plan are also specified in the Act, and the air tour management plan may prohibit commercial air tour operations in whole or in part. It may also establish conditions for the conduct of air tours, such as routes, altitudes, time of day restrictions, restrictions for particular events, and maximum number of flights, either on a year or a daily basis or other specified time frame. The air tour management plan applies to all commercial air tours within 1/2 mile outside the boundary of a national park and, as mentioned earlier, below 5,000 feet above ground level. An air tour management plan must include incentives for the adoption of quiet aircraft technology, and it also must provide for allocations of air tours when the air tour management plan limits the number of operations. In addition, the air tour management plan must justify and document the measures needed to protect the park resources, such as the altitudes or the routes and other parameters. And those are taken in account to include in the air tour management plan itself, and also include those justifications in the record of decision. Next slide. This slide, if you're on the participating via phone, this is a map of the United States with a list of the parks that we're doing air tour management plans at. We are doing plans for 24 parks across the US. Most are located in the Western United States. We have a cluster in Utah, some in Arizona, a couple in South Dakota, Washington. Obviously this one's in Washington, and then several in the San Francisco Bay Area and 2 in Hawaii. And we are working on all these plans concurrently. Next slide. For each air tour management plan, the Act requires that we publish the proposed air tour management plan in the Federal Register and hold at least one public meeting to inform the draft content of that air tour management plan. The air tour management plans also will comply with the National Environmental Policy Act and other legal requirements, such as the National Historic Preservation Act and the Endangered Species Act. And we also invite tribes to participate as cooperating agencies for National Environmental Policy Act compliances in cases where tribal lands are or may be overflown. Purpose of today's public meeting is to review the components of the draft air tour management plan for Mount Rainier. Next slide. And with that, I turn it back over to Michelle and Terry.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Vicki and Keith. We appreciate hearing from you. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Terry so we can hear a little bit more about the park's perspective.
Great, thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that. And I just want to start by saying thank you. It's great to see the turnout for this virtual public meeting. And I really just want to start by saying on behalf of Mount Rainier National Park, we're very happy that you've chosen to take some of your time to participate in this process. Your feedback and your comments are absolutely going to inform this air tour management plan for Mount Rainier National Park. And so this is definitely a great opportunity to hear what questions you have and provide additional information. With that, next slide, please. So Mount Rainier National Park, if you are here on this call, I am thinking that you are familiar with this national park. Mount Rainier is absolutely a magnificent landscape. It was established as a national park back in 1899. So for over a century, this has been a special place for people here in the United States. And Mount Rainier is certainly an icon on the landscape here in the Pacific Northwest. I'm not going to read the slide outright to you, but it is a magnificent place and it is a wilderness park. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but Mount Rainier National Park, again, 5th national park ever established back in 1899. And we had a lot of wilderness designated, approximately 97% of the park designated as part of the wilderness preservation system in 1988. Again, knowing that this is a place that is special to so many people, it's important to us to hear your feedback and let you know what we've been thinking about in the preparation of this draft air tour management plan and get the thoughts from you so that we can help to continue that planning process. Next slide. So just to orient you really quickly here, you'll see this map again in just a moment. We're taking a look in map view at the boundaries of Mount Rainier National Park, and just want to highlight a couple of things. When Keith earlier was talking about the scope of the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, he highlighted that it applies within the boundaries of a national park and within a half a mile from the exterior boundaries of a park. And so you'll see here the outer boundaries of Mount Rainier, and you'll see there's a buffer around there for that additional half mile around the edges. Also want to highlight that if you look at this map, you'll see there are some crosshatches across the landscape, both within and outside of Mount Rainier National Park. And those are areas both within the national park lands and on adjoining Forest Service lands that are designated as wilderness pursuant to the Wilderness Act. So this is the area that we're talking about today, and just want to make sure that folks have that picture in their minds. Next slide, please. All right, so park resources. There are so many amazing resources, fundamental resources and values at Mount Rainier National Park, and we're just going to highlight some of the key resources that we're thinking about as we develop this draft air tour management plan. First of all, I want to acknowledge that the lands that are now within Mount Rainier National Park are places that have been significant to affiliated tribes here for many, many years, many generations. And so we want to highlight that ongoing consultation with tribes is certainly integral to park management, and that includes the development of this draft air tour management plan. As I mentioned earlier, 97% of the park is designated as wilderness. That is fundamental to thinking about how we manage Mount Rainier National Park, and we've certainly heard from many of you, both during earlier planning efforts for air tour here at Mount Rainier, and certainly during the current public reviewing and comment period. So just want to assure you that that consideration of the preservation of wilderness character is absolutely in our minds. It is something that we consider in all planning here at Mount Rainier National Park. Also want to highlight, for the purposes of our wildlife, Mount Rainier does provide habitat for species that are listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act, and that includes the marbled murrelet and the northern spotted owl. We have other species and candidate species here as well, but those are two species in particularly that we took a hard look at because they can be sensitive to noise and disturbances, particularly during the nesting season. And so we did take a look at northern spotted owls. Their nesting period is from March 15th until September 30th of the year, and marbled murrelets. And here at Mount Rainier, they nest between April 1st and about September 23rd. And so you'll hear us reference some of the parameters that are included in the draft plan to avoid effects to those species. Also want to highlight that Mount Rainier does contain a National Historic Landmark District. It provides a great example of early park development, again, designated as a national park over 100 years ago. Some of that built environment outside of our designated wilderness, and in some cases within the designated wilderness, is also a spectacular place that a lot of our visitors experience and that we consider in our planning processes. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit here, talk about some of the existing air tour conditions at Mount Rainier National Park. At this time, we have 2 air tour operators that hold interim operating authority. Keith talked about that a little earlier, for a combined total of 34 flights each year that are authorized. Now, although up to 34 flights each year are authorized, our 3-year average at Mount Rainier has averaged only 1 air tour per year, as reported by one of those 2 existing operators. Now, the upper limit under current conditions would be that 34, and we're going to talk about what the proposal is for this draft air tour management plan in contrast to that number. There are certainly operating parameters that reflect current conditions that are not formalized in an air tour management plan right now. So at this time, other than that upper limit on the number of air tours, there are no other specific written requirements that pertain specifically to the national park. It's managed under the FAA rules. Next slide. So do you want to do a little compare and contrast so that folks can really see how the existing conditions relate to what is proposed in the draft air tour management plan here at Mount Rainier? Again, upper limit right now under existing conditions. And just to orient you to this slide, we've got some categories in the far left column. The next column over is describing what our existing conditions are. And then in the far right column are the conditions that are proposed. So again, existing conditions, air tour operators can fly up to 34 air tours per year with an average of 1 per year reported. The proposed air tour management plan for Mount Rainier would authorize up to 1 air tour per year. In terms of the altitudes, although there are currently no restrictions, that reported air tour activity that is currently occurring is reported at 3,000 feet above ground level, or AGL. And we would write that in as a condition in the air tour management plan that air tours would fly no lower than 3,000 feet above ground level. In terms of aircraft type, there's currently no specific requirements. The draft air tour management plan would allocate that air tour to a fixed wing air tour. And under time of day restrictions, there are currently no existing restrictions. However, current operations have been reported between the hours of 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. We are proposing to formalize that through the air tour management plan process as drafted. And we'll talk a little bit more about why in just a moment. Under day of week restrictions, there are currently no day of week restrictions, and we are not proposing any at this time. Also, in terms of required reporting or additional requirements, currently there is the semi-annual reporting that's required under NEPA with no additional requirements. Under the draft air tour management plan, those semi-annual reports would still be required. We would also have a requirement in there for training when it's offered by the National Park Service to be done in coordination with the air tour operator, an option for us to meet annually to check in and see how the air tour management plan is being implemented, and specified in-flight communications and frequency from FAA with the air tour operator. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's that map again that we looked at earlier. So what you'll see that's new here is a blue line that's coming in from the upper left corner, entering the park up towards the Carbon River area, circumnavigating around the Mount Rainier volcano itself, and then exiting the park. This is the proposed air tour route that our existing operator has reported, and it is the route that we are proposing in the draft air tour management plan to continue. This route can be flown in either direction, so either clockwise or counterclockwise, and I'll just give you a minute to take a look at that so you can see where that single air tour would operate under the draft air tour management plan. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to describe a little bit some of our thought process for the measures that we are proposing in our draft air tour management plan. Annual flight limits. And Vicki talked about this. The purpose of having air tour management plans is to certainly provide for aviation safety under the FAA requirements, but to help ensure that the Park Service is managing for the protection of park resources and values unimpaired. And by limiting the number of air tours to the 1 per year, the park feels that this measure would protect existing park soundscapes. Mount Rainier has fantastic natural soundscapes where people can go and experience relatively undisturbed natural soundscapes, get up into the wilderness and really have a fantastic experience, visitor experience in the wilderness, in the front country. People are hiking and exploring, and it's something that's very important to us to maintain the wilderness character, especially in that 97% of the park that is designated wilderness, and of course provide for the high quality habitat conditions for park wildlife which includes but is not limited to those endangered species that we discussed. So the condition that commercial air tours fly no lower than 3,000 feet above ground level would continue current practices. That was also consistent with the recommendations from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that say even during the nesting season that a fixed wing aircraft flight that is at least a quarter mile away from suitable nesting habitat will result in no effect to listed species. So that existing altitude is consistent with that protective measure, and we're proposing to make that permanent. In terms of time of day restrictions to avoid disruption, marbled murrelet, a listed species here, actually flies out to coastal waters to fish and bring food back to nestlings and young. They can be active at any time, but are particularly active at the dawn and dusk time periods. And by avoiding disruption during those 2 hours after dawn and 2 hours before sunset, it really minimizes the likelihood for air tours to disrupt feeding of those juveniles for marbled murrelets. It also has an additional benefit of providing opportunities to experience the wilderness and high quality visitor experiences without the potential for disruption from air tours during that same window of time, which is important for a number of wildlife species, as well as how people experience the park. Next slide, please. In limiting the proposed number of air tours to 1 per year, it would also reduce the air tour noise associated with those activities. Again, currently, air tours can be conducted either with helicopter or fixed wing, up to 34 per year. Under the proposed air tour management plan, by limiting it to 1 fixed wing air tour per year, it would reduce the potential for noise effects, which would help to protect wilderness character and visitor experience, and would still be consistent with the current reported number of air tours happening here at the park. The additional measure of providing for operator training and education and annual coordination meetings among an operator, the FAA, and the National Park Service would further help us be successful in meeting the intent and objectives of the National Parks Air Tour Management Act. Next slide. And I think with this one, I'm going to hand it back to Keith Lusk, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Great job. The development of an air tour management plan is considered a federal action. It's subject to environmental review. As we've noted a couple times, that the Federal Aviation Administration and the National Park Service must comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, in the development of this draft document. And that requires us to consider the effects of the air tour management plan on the human and natural environment. It also requires us to determine the appropriate level of environmental review and to prepare associated environmental review documents in that effort. At this time, the FAA and the Park Service are considering developing this air tour management plan at Mount Rainier under a National Park Service categorical exclusion. The agencies will consider public comments on the ATMP, as well as information we've obtained throughout the consultation process. I'll be speaking a little bit more about various consultation processes on the next couple of slides before we make a final decision on the appropriate level of environmental review. The agencies, we also have to comply not only with the National Environmental Policy Act, but there's a couple of special purpose laws, one regarding the National Historic Preservation Act and another one on the Endangered Species Act. If we could go to the next slide, please. So Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, the agencies are currently working to complete that process as part of the development of this ATMP. Section 106 includes requirements that the agencies define the undertaking here being the development of the air tour management plan, and identify participants, which we've done. Consulting parties, tribes, and other affected parties we've identified and made contact and are consulting with those folks now. We need to determine the area of potential effects. That's kind of the geographic area. We work with the consulting parties and the tribes to define that, as well as identify historic properties. Then we need to assess the effects on the historic properties, and then at kind of a last step, resolve the adverse effects to historic properties. And that's all done through that 106 consulting process between the agencies and the affected stakeholders. The FAA and the Park Service have initiated consultation, as I mentioned, with the state historic preservation offices, the tribes, and consulting parties. I think now I'm going to turn it over her back to Michelle, and she's going to touch on the Endangered Species Act.
All right, great. Thanks, Keith. So the FAA National Park Service are complying with Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, as they develop the draft ATMP. This is ensuring that the proposed actions do not jeopardize the existence of any species listed under ESA or result in the destruction or adverse modification of designated critical habitat. And as Terry alluded to earlier, the preliminary assessment completed by the FAA and the NPS does not anticipate these types of impacts. Next slide. So as noted earlier, we're currently inviting comment from the public, tribes, other agencies, and all interested parties on the draft. And comments we need to receive them by August 28th. Comments can either be submitted online through the National Park Service comment website. You'll see the link on the screen here, or by mail, also to the address on the screen. If for some reason you don't get this address when you go to the Pepsi site, you'll be able to find the mailing address for written comments there too. I'd also like to mention that there is a frequently asked questions document that's posted to the parks website, and it's right alongside the draft ATMP. If somebody from FAA could please drop the link to the Pepsi page into the social media platforms, it might make it easier for folks to find it. So next slide. So following the end of the public comment period, FAA and the NPS will review all of the comments and will use them to inform the final ATMP. We'll continue to coordinate and complete the tribal, the Section 106, and the Section 7 consultations, and we'll conclude the NEPA process by signing a decision document. Once all of this is wrapped up, the ATMPs will be considered complete and be posted and available on both the FAA and the National Park Service websites. FAA will then update the operation specifications for each air tour operator. And next slide. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to all of our presenters, and we'll now turn to the Q&A portion of the meeting. For those of you that may have joined during the presentations, I'm Michelle Carter. I'm an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service. I'm the moderator for the meeting this evening. So if you have a question you'd like to submit, please post it into the Google form using the link the FAA shared in the chat feature of whatever social media platform you're using, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. And another reminder that any questions submitted through today's meeting will be considered by the agencies as they continue developing the draft ATMP, but they're not actually considered formal comments. A formal comment must be submitted through the NPS Planning, Environment, and Public Comment, or we call it the Pepsi site, or sent to the mailing address is listed on the Parks Pepsi site. And again, both of these are displayed here on the slide. These formal comments that we receive will become part of the official record, and they must be submitted on or before August 28th of this year. So as noted at the beginning of the meeting, it's going to be, the meeting will last for 90 minutes. We plan to adjourn at 6 p.m. Pacific time. And in the event that questions are answered before that time, we'll continue to hold the meeting until 6 p.m. to allow for additional questions that might come in. We'll go off a camera, but just like check in from time to time. And so that's our plan. And with that, I'll be moving over here to our questions. So this first one we have here, looks like it would be better to go to Keith or the FAA. And it is a few similar questions. I'm sorry, what actually is an air tour? Does the plan apply to all planes over national parks? And can general manned aircraft fly over national parks? And so Keith, if you don't mind.
Sure. No, thank you. Thank you, Michelle. And great question. And some of the slides and my talking points tried to address that, but let me kind of reiterate that the air tour management plan only applies to commercial air tour operations. A commercial air tour operation is defined under FAA regulations, and it's essentially any commercial air tour is a flight conducted for compensation or hire in a powered aircraft for purposes of sightseeing over a national park unit. Also has to be over the park or within a half-mile boundary of the park, or over tribal lands during which the aircraft flies at or below 5,000 feet above ground level, except for purposes of takeoff or landing, or when necessary for the safe operation of the aircraft. Also does not include, as I mentioned previously, any type of general aviation activity, military activity, or commercial airline activity. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Keith. The next question for Vicki with the National Park Service. What are the roles of the NPS and the FAA and the ATMP? And is one the lead agency?
Sure, Michelle, I can answer that one. The role of NPS and a responsibility is to conserve the scenery, natural and historic objects, and wildlife in national parks, and ensuring they remain unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. The FAA has sole authority to control airspace over the US. The National Park Service and the FAA are working together to assist Mount Rainier in preparing its ATMP for the purposes of the National Environmental Policy Act, the National Park Territory Management Act designates FAA as the lead agency in that process.
Okay, great. Thank you, Vicki. The next question, we'll send it over to the park, send it over to Terry. Public comments during the previous planning efforts in 2010 and 2011 made it quite clear that wilderness values and noise impacts were a significant concern. The decision to withdraw from the exemption was based on Mount Rainier's responsibility under the Wilderness Act to preserve and protect wilderness character. Why is there no mention of the ATMP? Why is there no mention in the ATMP, of the Wilderness Act legislation, specifically when 97% of the park is designated wilderness? Why is there no mention of analyzing impacts specifically to the Wilderness Act?
Thank you, Michelle. And so I clearly, and I hope you heard it clearly through here, consideration of potential for effects to wilderness is central to our thought process at Mount Rainier National Park. We will take another look at that draft air tour management plan. And if that is not stated clearly enough, I think that that's the kind of feedback that we're looking for. Again, in looking at what's currently allowed in the absence of an air tour management plan, which is up to 34 air tours per year, including both fixed wing and helicopters. The proposed air tour management plan is thinking of the potential effects to wilderness character, and by limiting to one fixed wing air tour per year on an annual basis at a minimum altitude of 3,000 feet above ground level, those operating conditions and the others that we talked about earlier are intended to help ensure that wilderness character at Mount Rainier is protected and does not degrade from increased air tour activity in the parks. And so I hope that answers your question. We'll take another look at the text in the air tour management plan draft and make sure that it is clear that that designation of the Mount Rainier Wilderness is absolutely core to how we manage the park and is absolutely being considered as we develop the air tour management plan. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. And you can stay on camera here because I think the next one actually might be a good one for you. So from 2015 to 2017, there were no reported flights. There was one reported flight in 2018 and 2 flights in 2019. The 3-year average is 1 flight by an existing operator. So why go through this administrative process of managing and monitoring only one IOA? During the public review of draft alternatives in 2011, 72% of respondents supported the no air tours alternative. The FAA briefing statement does say an ATMP may prohibit commercial air tours in whole or in part. Why not prohibit air tours at Mount Rainier National Park?
There were many thoughts in that question, so let me see if I can respond to as many of them as I can. So first of all, and this was actually referenced in an earlier comment, so as a park that has fewer than 50 annual air tours per year authorized right now, the park could have been exempt under NEPATMA from needing to prepare an air tour management plan. However, leadership at Mount Rainier National Park withdrew that exemption specifically to ensure that even though we have fewer than 50 air tours that are authorized, that we develop an air tour management plan in coordination with the Federal Aviation Administration so that we can ensure that any air tours that are authorized follow conditions and are formalized to make sure that park resources and values are protected. And so I actually have fielded that question from a few folks outside of this meeting in terms of one air tour per year, why go through this planning process? And that is how I understand it, is that we are using this planning process to define what is appropriate at Mount Rainier National Park, even though it is below the 50 air tours per year. Again, I want to highlight that, we are in a public review period. So the question about, well, why not propose an air tour management plan that has 0 air tours per year, your feedback, that is exactly the kind of question and comment that this group of folks is interested in hearing. I absolutely looked at the comments that were received by the park during the earlier 2010 planning effort and have looked at every comment that's come in so far during this public review period. So I just want to assure you, your time and investment in engaging with the park and with the FAA in this process is very important to us. And just please, as was pointed out, in addition to your questions in this meeting tonight, please, if you have not already gone to the park planning website to submit your comments formally, that'll really help us make sure that we're getting everybody's input into the record so that it can support decision making. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Terry. The next question will go to Keith and the FAA. So the park is stating that they're not proposing to increase the number of air tours conducted. However, the ATMP in section 6 and 7 includes provisions for new entrants to apply for operating authority to conduct air tours and request by an existing operator for additional operating authority through a competitive bidding process. This gives the appearance of opening the door for increased scenic flights and operators beyond the existing proposed single operator and 1 flight per year. Can provisions in this ATMP prohibit any changes that might allow potential helicopter tours in the future?
Well, the Act does provide provisions for new entrants to apply into not only parks under IOA, but also new entrants under air tour management plans. For the purposes of this ATMP, that would be any other operator except the one that's currently identified as part of this plan. So the FAA and the Park Service are in the future going to publish additional information for interested parties about the form and required content of a new entrant application, and we will jointly review those applications. That doesn't mean we're going to accept them, but it is something that we would look at and we would consider. Those would be offered. I think, generally, who knows what things are going to be like in 2-3 years down the road. There could be quieter technology. There could be an air tour operator who maybe proposes a route that's better than something that we haven't currently thought of. So that is a provision. It doesn't mean that we're going to be accepting them all or any of them in this case, but it is something that air tour operators would be able to apply to, and it would be something that we would consider on a periodic basis, even when this air tour management plan is stood up.
Great, thank you, Keith. The next question would be for Vicki. How are the flight numbers, which includes 1 for Rainier, determined? Why were these routes considered, and what impacts had been analyzed for the areas in the flight path?
Thanks, Michelle. So there's 2 questions there. So as mentioned during the presentation, the 3-year average from the reporting data is 1 flight per year from the 1 operator. And based on the route they're flying, this flight and route under this ATMP would be managed. And it's intended to protect the park soundscapes and the visitor experience, wilderness character, and wildlife by limiting the number of potential disturbances just to once per year caused by commercial air tour. In addition, the cultural resources, related cultural landscapes and ethnographic resources may also, based on consultation, may also include additional considerations as identified during the consultation under Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act. So we're still like in that consultation process, and we'll be considering other input received from this public review period and the consultation processes.
Thank you, Vicki. The next question would be for Terry. Well, why can't tours just fly outside of the park boundaries for the view?
I'll take a stab at this, and then if Keith or Vicki want to jump in. So just by definition, the National Parks Air Tour Management Act only applies to lands, or sorry, the airspace above national park lands in that half-mile boundary. So if folks were flying outside of that area, it would be outside of the scope of our air tour management plan as defined by the National Parks Air Tour Management Act. And again, that number and what kinds and amounts of air tours would occur over Mount Rainier is exactly what we're seeking feedback from you all on right now. So keep the questions coming, and Keith, if you want to add to that, please feel free.
Yeah, I think you answered most of it very well there, Terry. I would note, yes, the jurisdiction of the air tour management plan only goes to the half-mile boundary around the park. Once outside there, this air tour management plan has no jurisdiction over any air tours. Air tour operators could fly as much as they want outside that half-mile buffer. Again, I think there is that opportunity that the Act provides for people to see the park in a different way. While it's only one flight, might be someone's chance of a flight of a lifetime. So we provide that, and think that under this air tour management plan that that is an appropriate number for this plan.
Thank you, Keith. So the next one will go to Vicki. Is the proposed single air tour per year really worth the paperwork involved?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, parks that have fewer than 50 reported air tours are exempt from the requirement to do an air tour management plan. And the Park Service decided that it was worth doing an air tour management plan here and withdrew the exemption, because that does allow the air tours to be managed in terms of the routes and the altitudes and the number.
Okay, thanks, Vicki. So the next question is asking for clarification if the one air tour per year means just one air tour operator is authorized, or is it just one actual flight? And the answer is it is just one actual flight. The next question will go back to Vicki. What specific NPS categorical exclusion citation is being considered for the Nepa compliance?
The FAA and the NPS are considering developing this air tour management plan under NPS categorical exclusion, and that one is 3.3A1 from the National Park Service Environmental Policy Act Handbook, which allows changes or amendments to an approved action when such changes would cause no or only minimal environmental impact. Because this proposed action is very similar to the existing air tour operations and includes the new operating parameters as the route and the altitudes, the impacts resulting from the effects of this proposed action would result in no or only minimal environmental impacts. In addition, the inclusion of these operating parameters with the altitude restrictions, the time of day restrictions, And the quiet aircraft technology incentives would ensure that the park would only experience beneficial impacts to the environment compared to current conditions, because under current conditions, there's no specified routes or altitudes. It could go up to 34 tours per year. So we are considering public comments on this air tour management plan draft. And so the information obtained during the consultations and the public comments, and then we'll fully assess those environmental impacts before making a final determination on what NEPA pathway is appropriate.
Great, thanks, Vicki. The next question will go to Keith at FAA. At 3,000 AGL minimum, is there a LMAX established?
Well, I'm sure there is a LMAX reading. I'm not sure if we have that information, but we can follow up on that. I mean, this ATMP does limit noise by including other conditions such as the altitude, aircraft type, day or time restrictions for particular events. So again, we're talking about a very, very limited number of flights, likelihood that's going to minimize recurring sound events underneath it on its tour of the park.
Okay, thanks, Keith. The next question is for Vicki. Have noise-sensitive areas been identified by the NPS at Rainier?
Yes, we have baseline acoustic ambient data that was collected by the Park Service during earlier planning efforts. And as also has been mentioned, the park identified noise-sensitive areas and other areas of resource concern during the planning process.
And the next one's for you, Keith. How often will the ATMP be reviewed and possibly changed at Rainier?
So it really depend. An air tour management plan could be amended at any time. The agencies would jointly consider any requests to amend an air tour management plan. Those requests could actually come from either one of the agencies. You know, from our perspective, maybe for purposes of aviation safety from the Park Services side, maybe for some park protection of resource concerns that maybe hadn't originally been thought about or considered, or after the fact impacts became more aware of that. So there is the provision for those amendments, and there's also provisions for outside stakeholders to submit something to the agencies for review. We will be providing additional information on that amendment process and what we would look at to consider it. It would have to be submitted in writing. The submitter would also have to indicate how that amendment ensures that the objectives of the air tour management plan are still achieved, i.e. protection of park resources, visitor experiences, aviation safety, all those types of things. The notice of the amendments, if the agencies agreed to move forward with that, would go through a Federal Register process as well as a comment review period.
Thank you. Okay, Vicki, since there is only one operator listed in the ATMP, what happens if other operators also want to fly over? Will the flight frequency limit be increased, or will the flights be split among the providers?
As Keith mentioned earlier, the National Parks Air Tour Management Act does include provisions for new entrants to apply for operating authority to conduct tours. However, that application gets reviewed by the FAA and the Park Service and is subject to either approval or not being approved. If it is approved, it the average of 1 tour per year would just be maintained. Any other operator request would have to go, if there was a request for an increase, just process-wise, that would trigger another NEPA and other consultation requirements. That's just how that process works. That just because someone applies, like I said, it has to go through a review process to determine if it would be approved.
Great, thanks. And then, Terry, I think that this one will go to you. Does the NPS region have any policy to ensure no future degradation from the current condition and improvement of wilderness character in areas currently impacted by air tour noise? Does the NPS region have a policy where parks with very few existing air tours will manage those flights through specific objectives to eliminate and/or avoid negative impacts to wilderness character from air tour noise? And finally, how does the NPS analyze any of the soundscape data collected to assess potential air tour noise impacts on wilderness character? I know that's a really big question. If you need me to repeat any part of it at any time, let me know.
Yep, sounds good. And I might ask Vicki to chime in as well in terms of how we monitored and acquired data for the baseline for the soundscapes here at Mount Rainier National Park, because that work did occur during previous planning efforts. So we have a baseline for what the soundscape environment is here at Mount Rainier National Park. And then in looking at the number of air tours, the route, the altitude, that is modeled to help us understand what the noise levels would be, and any changes to those levels, we would be able to assess what the noise impacts would be in terms of the sound itself. Going back to what I think I heard, heard you say is the underlying question, does the region have specific guidance? I'm actually going to step it back a little bit. And so when we're talking about how we are meeting the requirements of the Wilderness Act, we're looking at it through the lens of both the act itself. So the Wilderness Act is a law. We are looking at it through the, losing my voice. We are looking at it through the context of our National Park Service management policies. National Park Service management policies were last updated in 2006. There was an entire chapter on wilderness management and the preservation of wilderness character. And there is language that applies to wilderness across all National Park Service systems that have it, that speaks specifically to how we will consider the effects of aircraft use within wilderness areas, that really highlights the need to preserve wilderness character, to consider how it would affect the aesthetics, the quality of the experience, a number of things. I won't read it out loud to you, although I did pull the text up so that I could have it available. In addition to that, we have additional implementing policy and practices that come through that community of practice that the federal agencies that have lands within the wilderness preservation system consider as we're making management decisions. And then we also look at it through the framework of planning documents. And we go back to our Park Foundation document, which highlights again that one of the fundamental resources and values, one of the things that makes Mount Rainier significant is our designated wilderness. It's just integral to the character of the park. And so we look to have a non-degradation policy. And so having that baseline and seeking to ensure that wilderness character is protected and not degraded is something that is consistent with all levels of policy direction that we have, and also the legal direction from the Wilderness Act itself. Hopefully, if that didn't get at the question that the person was asking, they can type in a clarifying question and I'll do my best to field it. But again, yes, we do have a lot of guidance and are looking very seriously at that, including at specifically noise from aviation over designated wilderness. Thanks, Michelle.
Great, thanks, Terry, and good job keeping all of that together in your head as part of the response. Someone is asking if there is a map of noise-sensitive areas available. Vicki, do you want to chime in on that?
I think the draft ATMP does include some areas that are noise sensitive, and I might have to send this one back to Terry, but I think the wilderness, I mean, the park's 97% wilderness, so I I would call that out. I think that's called out on the map in the air tour management plan. Is that correct, Terry?
It is correct, Vicki, and I'll just jump in really quickly. So absolutely, with 97% of the park being designated wilderness, it is all a noise sensitive environment within that designated wilderness area. So that covers the majority of the park. Other lenses that we look at it through is we do have maps that show what we consider to be suitable habitat for some of our noise sensitive species like the northern spotted owl and the marbled murrelet, with habitat ranges that go up to 3,800 and 4,800 feet within suitable forested environments. And so we absolutely looked at that in considering where we would have some sensitive landscape elements to consider through this decision-making process. And again, of course, even when you're not in wilderness, the quality of the visitor experience is something that we're considering outside of wilderness, and in some cases overlapping it. We're within our Mount Rainier National Historic Landmark District. We also know that we have lands that are still important to our affiliated tribes, and through the consultation that is underway, we're hoping to learn if there are additional things that we have not yet considered that should be captured through this planning process. So excellent questions. And again, if my response is not getting to what you're trying to ask, please take another stab at drafting that question and I will do my best to answer your question. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So we did get a question about unmanned aircraft systems, UAS, and they otherwise known as drones, and they're actually not part of NEPATMA or the ATMP. So questions about those are actually outside of the scope of what we're talking about today. Okay, so as stated, we're going to stay on for a little bit longer. We don't have any more questions coming in, but we're going to leave this slide up, and I'm going to go on mute and off video for a couple of minutes just to give folks a chance to think about what they've heard today, and if there's any additional questions, the team wants to be here to answer those. So I'll just go off, but we'll stay live for a little bit here, and please continue to submit your questions. So Terry, looks like we have a clarifying question related to the drones. The individual's just asking for clarification that although that the drones are outside the scope of this plan, they want to confirm that drones are not allowed to launch within National Park Service units.
Yeah, no, thank you. And again, I'm not like the super expert on drones, but it is accurate that the use of drones within the national park is not authorized. So launching a drone in the park is not something that's currently allowable. I know it's a beautiful landscape and folks might want to be able to bring their own drone out to the park. However, that is not something that is allowable within the park boundaries. And if folks have additional questions that I can't answer, I'm happy to follow up as needed or provide references to what policies or regulations apply. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And it looks like we're waiting on a couple more questions here. So just stay tuned a second and we will get to a couple of more questions. Okay, another one here then for Terry. Excuse me, the NEPA process seems flawed if the NPS and FAA have already focused on using a categorical exclusion and not to go through a full environmental assessment process with a full range of alternatives, including no air tours. Preparation of an EA would provide public with the opportunity to see soundscape data and a map of noise sensitive areas. And so why is no EA being considered?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Michelle. So I think just to try to answer the question. So at this time, we feel that the effects of the proposed action are consistent with the use of a categorical exclusion. But again, we're in a public review period. So as we hear from you and review your comments, we will take a look at that determination that we've made initially. And if it looks as though it would be more appropriate for us to go through a different NEPA pathway, that's something that the planning team will take a look at. In terms of additional information, if there is specific information that folks are looking for, please let me know, as long as it's not data that is sensitive for us to provide, like the specific locations of a northern spotted owl nest. We will look at being able to provide that information. I know we did get an earlier request for some additional background information on the previous air tour management planning effort at Mount Rainier, and we added some of that information to the project website. So if folks are looking for some of that specific information, please put it in either your comments or put it into the forum or the chat here today. And if it's information that we have available that we can share publicly, we can add that to the project website. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Terry. Still waiting on a couple more questions to come in. So folks, feel free to stay on the line and continue thinking about the presentations and other questions that you might have. Okay, so for the next question, Terry, I think we'll give it to you first, and Vicky may be interested in adding on. But the question is, how can noise impacts be considered with no use of the word decibel or any data on noise levels with and without air tour noise?
Glad that Vicky's camera came on as well. So I think I can take part of this, and Vicky can speak to the technical aspects of it, because there has been, like I mentioned, that baseline sound data, which includes information in decibels and some modeling work that is helping to inform this process. I do want to emphasize again that, you know, when we look at the sound levels that are associated with a single fixed wing aircraft flying at 3,000 feet above ground level, for example, and I mentioned this earlier, that is consistent with a no effect determination for species like the northern spotted owls and the marbled murrelet, even during the nesting season, because of that reduced decibel level and disturbance factor. So it is something that is being looked at. Appreciate the question. It's a good question. And Vicky, do you want to speak more to some of the more technical aspects of those sound levels as is being questioned?
Sure, Terry, and thanks for that question. Yeah, and this is part of the justification to that information that goes into the draft air tour management plan. And this is there is some summary of this in section 4 of the draft air tour management plan. And we do include, you know, we did look at the sound level of the aircraft at 3,000 feet above ground level. And that is at, let me see here, I gotta look it up because I don't have it off the top of my head. At 2,000 feet above ground level, the aircraft in questions is 57.4 decibels. That's an LMAX. It is below the sound injury threshold for northern spotted owls. And at 3,000 feet, that sound level is even lower. So those restrictions are intended to avoid the disruption to the marbled murrelets, and also preserves wilderness character by reducing the intensity of air tour noise to visitors on ground. So there is some information in the air tour management draft air tour management plan if you want to, you know, if you want to take a closer look at that explanation.
Okay, great. Thanks, Vicky. Looks like we're once again a bit on the quiet end of questions. So as stated before, we'll keep the meeting open. We'll go off camera, but please continue to go ahead and submit any questions you might have using the chat feature. So we've had another question come in that maybe I'll go ahead and take a stab at here. The question is regarding CADX 3.3A1, actions related to general administration, which is the changes or amendments to an approved action when such changes would cause no or minimally environmental impact. That's the CE citation. So the person's asking what the approved action is that it's referring to. And so the approved action is actually interim operating authority, which is up to 34 air tours per year at Mount Rainier, in combination with the average reported air tours, which is just one per year fixed wing aircraft. So looking at that context, there's no change in the actual effects from the reported air tours, and it's actually beneficial in terms of the number of air tours authorized in the context of potential noise effects to wilderness character, wildlife, and visitor experience. I don't know if anybody else has anything else they want to chime in related to that, but if that doesn't answer the question, feel free to add in any clarifying question into the text and we'll do our best to answer. And just a note, it looks like there's still a couple more questions coming in, so just stay tuned here. Thank you all. Okay, a question here for Keith. While one flight per year does not seem like much in and of itself, does allowing any flights at all open it up to an easier increase in that number later? Does disallowing any flights now change that possibility?
No, we really look at these independently. As we mentioned previously, there is that new entrant provision that could come into effect whether, we have a air tour management plan that currently doesn't allow any tours at the park. That isn't into perpetuity. We've indicated that we would look at new entrant applications periodically as they came in and review them and make some type of determination, so that there would always be that ability, whether, we banned it right now at Mount Rainier and didn't allow that one air tour, or we just kept it at one air tour. It doesn't increase or decrease the future opportunity for someone to at least submit an application for consideration. Again, the onus then falls back on the agencies to review that application and make some determinations as to whether we would go forward with that or not, which may entail, additional environmental review and a whole host of other things.
Okay, thank you, Keith. And looks like a couple more are coming in here in just a minute. Okay, and Vicky, here's one for you. When will a final decision be made whether a full NEPA analysis should be done? And when is the deadline for a final decision?
Okay, thanks for that question. Obviously we're taking public comment right now. And as we review those comments, we will be also completing other consultations through section 106 and section 7. And then we will take a look at the analysis of those effects consistent with NEPA. That type of documentation that is most appropriate will be informed by the feedback we receive during this public review to identify if there are additional effects yet not identified, and if we need to still analyze those effects, and then whether or not there's a potential for adverse effects that would make a different NEPA pathway more appropriate, such as environmental assessment or documented categorical exclusion. And just just a reminder too, that categorical exclusion doesn't mean it's excluded from NEPA, it just means it's excluded from preparing an environmental impact statement. So we are definitely taking a close look at the NEPA process. So as far as a specific deadline, like I said, we're still in some consultation processes right now, so there isn't a specific deadline. We are under a court order to have, and we submitted it to the court last year, that we would get the air tour management plans done by next August of 2022. So the best I can say right now is sometime within that time frame. If it would take longer than that, we will give the court specific and concrete reasons why we were going to take longer than that.
Great, thanks, Vicki. And it looks like we might have one or two more questions coming in, so just a moment. Okay, and we have one last question that came in here, asking about a follow-up to get the questions and answers. And I just wanted to remind folks that the meeting is going to be recorded and it will be posted to the websites. So you'll be able to go on and revisit the Q&A session and everything that we did here this afternoon. And with that, we actually are coming to the end here of our meeting time. Before closing us out, though, I'd like to turn it over to Terry Tucker for a couple of words.
Thank you, Michelle. So I know the whole planning team really appreciates folks taking the time out of your busy days to engage with us in this planning process, but I did also want to specifically say thank you from Mount Rainier National Park. I know this is an important place for many folks, and certainly for those of you that are taking the time to be with us today, and I would just appreciate your engagement and your good questions, and we look forward to reviewing your comments. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Terry. Thank you for being here with us. So I just want to make mention again here really quick that there is the frequently asked questions document that's posted to the Parks Pepsi page alongside the draft ATMP. Excuse me, I have a little tickle in my throat. If you had a question that was not answered during the Q&A session, you can contact Terry directly at the park, and her phone number, actually, if FAA could drop Terry's phone number into the chat area of the social media platforms, that would be great. But for folks, if you want to jot down really quick Terry's phone number for additional questions, it's 360-569-6507. Again, that's 360-569-6507. And if for whatever reason you don't catch that, you can get her contact information from the Pepsi site too. Just a reminder that the questions that were submitted to today's meeting will be considered by the agencies as they continue drafting the ATMP, but they're not the formal comments. The formal comments we're asking that you submit them through the Pepsi page, the planning environment and public comment page, or send via mail to the addresses listed on that site. These formal comments will become a part of the official record and a reminder that we need to receive them by August 28th of 2021. Thank you again for your participation. On behalf of both the FAA and the NPS, we really do look forward to hearing from you. Have a great rest of your evening. Take care.